Hey guys, Jeff Francoeur here. Thanks for listening to our content and please like and subscribe. Before we get to the podcast, if you have middle school or high school kids that play sports and you don't want to fundraise like me, we got you covered. My buddy Chris Carneal owns Booster. Chris?
We help schools and sports teams raise funds in a super fun and engaging way. In fact, the last 22 years, we've raised $750 million, and we can't wait to help you. Choose booster.com.
Jeff Francoeur here with Pure Athlete, along with Britt Lee and Brad Williams. Guys, I'm excited about today's guest. Yes, he went to Auburn, which we'll forgive him for that, but played tennis there and was All-American. But one of the cool things was not so much about his youth sports thing, but he's one of the leading guys in sports science. And I think it's going to be cool to have him be able to answer a lot of the questions that parents ask us all the time. So with that being said, Mark Kovacs, thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys so much. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
So before we get going, let kind of fill us in. Like when people say, what is sports science? What are you talking about? What is exactly that you do?
Yeah, it's a great question because when I sort of started in this field, it was very new. There weren't many sports scientists in sports. There was a lot of folks that did coaching, front office, scheduling, strength and conditioning, athletic training, things like that. But the sports science field was really evaluating how can we use scientific principles to answer the questions that the coaches have, that the strength coaches have, and how do we integrate all that from biomechanics to physiology to nutrition to psychology to analytics. All those areas have their own disciplines, and a true sports scientist integrates all of those to provide the best answers that parents have, that coaches have, that players have, and that's sort of the real role nowadays of sports science. And then you have your true experts in their narrow area. Just like in, say, baseball, you have a hitting coach. They're an expert in hitting. They don't necessarily do pitching. Whereas in sports science, you may have a biomechanist who's really good at the mechanics of the body, but they don't know much about nutrition. So a role of a sports scientist who's a generalist, who's sort of where I fit, is trying to integrate all those areas to make sure that we're using the best evidence that we have and make sure that the data that we're utilizing is actually going to help those athletes, coaches, teams, etc.
Which is so true, real quick. Sorry, and I'll let you go. But it's funny because, you go in the locker room, the nutritionist thinks they're the most important person. You go in the training room, we need him right now, And so it is great to have someone that can oversee that.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, Mark, you work with professional athletes across tennis, across baseball, soccer, basketball. What is this whole area? How does it get applied to young people?
Yeah, it's what we can learn from the pros is fantastic because they've gone through the journey and they've succeeded in their sport. They may not have succeeded in life and a lot of other areas, but they've succeeded in their sport. So there's a lot to learn from that we can bring down. And then we also learn about the ones that should have succeeded and didn't. They got injured, they got burnt out, they ran into some trouble that couldn't get them to that next level. And so we try to take those learnings and bring them down to the next generation to help them make the right decisions when they can based on experience, but also avoid the wrong decisions. And that's where the pro athlete side is so valuable to me because I'm across, like you said, 4 or 5 different sports now, and all these athletes are very similar. I mean, the best at what they do have this very similar makeup. They're disciplined. They do the little things well every single day. They're kind of boring, most of them. Most of them are like they want the same routine. They want to go through the same steps. You take them out of their routine, they freak out a little bit sometimes. Whereas a lot of young athletes and parents as well are like always looking at go here, go there, left, right. And it's like the path is pretty straight. And you just got to do the boring stuff over and over again and do it with the right intent and trust that process really well. So you got to get good advisors. That's really the biggest thing that I've learned over the 2 decades or so of working in this field is make sure you listen to the people that have done it and have experience and are doing it for the right reasons.
Mark, if you could break down, I don't know if this is possible, maybe a trick question, but if you could break down kind of what you do, what percentage of it would be injury prevention, what percentage would be like health related, and what percentage would be performance related?
Yeah, it's a great question, and
I
unfortunately,
love that. I love when I get that. Just, can we put that? Make
It
sure
was it was okay.
He doesn't get too many of those, so we'll give it to him.
Mark's very polite.
and because that's how most people think about it, and that's probably due to some historical discussions of siloed training. Hey, this is the injury prevention area, this is the performance area, this is the health and wellness medical area, and they're the same. I mean, you can't take one that doesn't have an impact on the other. If I do shoulder exercises for throwing, is that injury prevention or is that performance? It's both. You have to sort of do that to be able to perform. If I am getting blood work, so a lot of people will think that's health, wellness, medical, but that blood work's going to show you a handful of things that is going to improve your performance. Not only tell you if you're deficient in some minor nutrient that may help you health-wise, but it's also going to help your performance. So one of the biggest things I've tried to do is integrate those three areas that you mentioned and say we don't break them out in those silos, even though the specialists are siloed because they're experts in those areas. But we then need to integrate them and say we're going to improve this, which is not only going to help reduce injuries, but it's going to help you throw harder or hit better or run faster or whatever it is. So it's a great question, and I think for ease of use, people have put them into categories, but the higher up you get, the more they cross over, and there's true integration there.
I'm going to jump right in because number one question I get asked all the time, and even I got kids now, 9, 7, 4, and 2 that will be getting, but the weight room for me, weight training. What's an appropriate age?
Not two.
Yeah. Well, my 2.5-year-old, we got him in some different agility stuff now. But,
ladder drills and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. But what's appropriate?
Yeah, it's probably the number one question you get with youth sport is, and I think the question has been asked incorrectly historically because people think of weight training as get a barbell, put a bunch of 45s on there, and have someone squat. That was historically what people thought of as a weight room. And now it's bands, it's 5-pound dumbbells, it's medicine balls, it's this entire continuum of exercises. And I always say you can start them as young as possible as long as they can comprehend instruction and do the technique that a coach or someone is trying to get them to do the right way. They're not going to lift heavy, obviously. You want to be very careful with load. Load is unnecessary at the young age. It's about technique. It's about intent, meaning moving the movement in the right way. And the goal there, just like learning any skill, is you're trying to learn the skill. You're not trying to load as heavy as possible. So it's pretty young. The younger, the better, as long as they can understand instruction, but the load has to be limited. That's the big caveat to that.
Yeah, so it's more band, it's more
Exactly.
agility type
body
stuff.
weight stuff,
weight, yeah.
5, 10 pounds. I always make the inference, a push-up a lot of people think's fine, but that's actually a lot harder than a 10-pound dumbbell bench press. If you use a 10-pound dumbbell, that's actually easier on a 12-year-old than a push-up would be. So it's not about are they lifting weights or not lifting weights. Is the load appropriate? So definitely low load, and then improving the technique. And then we measure height, and we use a concept known as peak height velocity. I'm not sure if that's come up with anyone listening, but generally that is your speed of growth. So you have this peak height that you grow. It's sort of the growth spurt, but it's the time. So the shortest amount of time you have with the most amount of growth. So think about it over like a 3-month period. If you grow 3 inches in 3 months, that would be your peak height velocity. There's an actual time point that happens at. And we know that about 6 months to 18 months after that peak height is when you have your highest growth hormone and testosterone levels in your entire life. And that's when you actually want to hit them hard in the weight room. That's typically mid-late high school.
Yeah.
Is when that kicks in for most guys. It's a year or two younger for most girls. And that's when you want to make sure their technique is optimized so they can actually load heavy. That's the sort of sweet spot of loading, but you got to make sure their technique is good going in. You got to make sure their mobility and stability through the hips and core and legs is all good. And then in that 6 to 18 month window, that's kind of the time to really, okay, we're going to lift you as heavy as possible. We're going to go and get you as strong as we possibly can during that period. That's the safest time to lift heavy. But you got to spend 2, 3, 4 years prepping for that window.
What about flexibility? Flexibility training, and my boys were tennis players, and in their tennis academies, they would typically do flexibility training for 5 minutes or so, and my boys were never flexible. And it's hard to get kids to recognize the importance of flexibility, but I got to think it's important in every sport.
Yeah.
So what's your recommendation on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a broad area, flexibility, because most sports, you're more flexible in certain movements and very inflexible in others because of the adaptation. Like if you think of throwing or serving, we have great external rotation in the shoulder when we throw because of the mechanics of throwing. You actually develop that adaptation over many years of throwing or serving. And then you have very poor internal rotation of the shoulder. So you have restricted limitation. And that's a protective mechanism actually by the body. It's adapted over time. But the more restriction you have in internal rotation, the more likely that there's a big link with shoulder problems, internal impingement issues, rotator cuff injuries, stuff like that. So if you let that adaptation happen for too long, you have a major concern. So you have to address that in a sport-specific way. Flexibility and mobility is very sport-specific because of the adaptations the body goes through over many years of training. So it's not about just going to a yoga class, which a lot of people say, hey, is yoga good? Like, yoga's great if you pick and choose the right exercises for your sport. You can't just go to a regular class and do everything everyone else does, because it's going to overstretch some of the areas you're already flexible in, and it's not going to impact the areas that you need the most stretching on. So it's always like, yes, the area is vital. It's just like strength training, it's vital, but you got to do it right, and you got to make it appropriate for the age of the athlete and then also the sport that they're playing.
So can I take a step back here? So obviously I think healthy parents are most concerned when they put their kids in sports, they're most concerned about their health and safety, hopefully. But in terms of hopefully, yes. In terms of development, what the nature versus nurture question, because you see so many kids doing so much additional work besides their basic sports skill work. They're doing speed and agility. They're doing flexibility. They're learning about nutrition. But there also there's a limit to how fast someone can run. So what percentage can a kid or a teen progress in terms of speed, explosiveness, things like that? There's going to be a limit. So what percentage can doing these type of things help them increase that?
Yeah, no, the genetic aspect to sports is huge. People don't want to address it as much as they should. There was some really great genetics research about 35 years ago now showing that over 50% of results is genetics. But that also means there's about 45 to 50% that is training. But if you don't have that 50%, genetics, doesn't matter how much training you're going to do, you're not going to get the result.
Yep.
And people don't always like to hear that, that, hey, it's just, this was the hand you were dealt.
Your kid wasn't dealt an ace card.
Yeah.
It was tough, wasn't it, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, it really was. I'm still trying to touch the rim. I mean, it really is kind of tough.
And then you got all the stuff that came out with the outliers and some of the research on 10,000 hours and how that was misinterpreted, and that gave people hope. That was like, all you have to do is spend 10,000 hours training and you'll be an expert. And the data was correct. It was taken way past what the research had shown, though. The data was, you're going to become an expert in a skill. You weren't going to be a professional athlete making millions of dollars. That was never said. It was said, you're going to be competent and you're going to be in the top, say, 10% in that skill set. But that doesn't mean you're going to be in the top 0.001% of the people in the world that do what you do. So people very much, and that was intent, that was done by the marketing folks around a few of these books and concepts, that was allowing that sort of misinformation to populate. And people wanted to believe it. Parents wanted to believe it. And hopefully now people understand that that'll get you really skilled. There's pretty much any kid that puts the right work in the US should be able to get a college scholarship somewhere. They may not be the school they want to go to, but if they're willing to do the work, they're going to become expert enough in that skill set. But to be a professional athlete, that's a whole nother discussion. Yeah.
And then at what point too, though, we sit here and talk, do you say, let a kid be a kid too? and you're doing all this stuff. And one thing, these guys know it, I think our audience knows it, I'm very passionate in multiple sports and not just one sport at 9 years old. How many kids do you see, that are doing one sport, or the burnout rate, compared to multiple sports where you're learning different techniques?
Yeah, it's the biggest challenge out there. It is, when you're, 12 and under, there's zero reason to commit to one sport. You want to play as many sports as possible. You want to get really passionate, obviously. You want to see that the kids are truly passionate. And we all have been around kids that we know they're doing it because the parent wants them to do it. And you see it very quickly.
Yeah.
I coach some of them.
Yeah, and that's the hard part. The hard part is you want to have kids in sports that they really enjoy and are passionate about. It's good for them to sample. Sampling different sports at a young age is one of the best things, because most people don't know what the kid is going to be passionate about until they get exposed to it. So if they're in 6 to 8 different sports in a 3-year period between 5 and 8 or 9, that's great, because then they get to see where their skill sets are, and it may be something off the wall. The parent may not really have ever thought of that. So sampling is really, and there's great data on sampling because it develops a unique skill set. They learn how to run, jump, throw, catch, roll, react, all the cognitive skills in these different sports. And then at some point, they're going to be passionate and committed and want to go down a path of, hey, this is this 1 or 2 sports that I really want to focus on. And then it's about how do you put the schedule together so they optimize the schedule. They don't overplay. They train enough on the things that the games and the practices don't teach them. Because that's the other argument. And there is a small group of people that do want to specialize, and it's coming from the kid. And that's, people know that. It's that kid that wakes up on their own and goes and hits by themselves, throws by themselves. No one's pulling them. There was some great research out of Michigan State, Dr. Dan Gould's lab, about 20 years ago. And it was this concept of the parental push versus the parental pull. You don't want to be a parent that pulls your kid to practice, but if the kid's wanting to do something, there's the ability to help them. It's this, and this was for kids that ended up becoming professional athletes. Every professional athlete typically had some driver, a parent, an advisor, a coach, a mentor, someone that was there to help them through those tough moments. Those days when they lost back to back to back and wanted to quit, and they really didn't want to quit; they were just frustrated. And that's a really challenging area, because the parents want to do the best job possible, but many times it's really hard because you've got an N of 1 in research, and N is the number of people in the study. So normally the bigger the N, 100,000 people, means the study's more impactful and valuable because you've got more people. But in sports, every study is an N of 1. It's a case study of one athlete and how they respond to the stresses of being a youth athlete and trying to be the best they can be.
Yeah, you guys have heard this and our audience heard it, but it's so hard as a parent. I had twin boys. They trained the same way. They did all the same things. One of them had shoulder impingement, took him out for 10 months, surgery on both knees. The other one had nothing. So and then you deal with the disappointments, and parents have to wear so many hats that it's really, really difficult.
No, it's the hardest job in sports. It always has been, because there's the emotional connection that you can't get away from.
Yeah.
But then many times the emotional decision is probably not the right decision. There's better decisions 100%. To be made. Yeah. And that's the hardest part. Whereas a third-party coach or a mentor or someone that maybe is one step removed can look at it and be like, even though that's the emotional decision, the right decision is probably something completely opposite, which is really tough to do.
So you brought up safely specializing. When a kid finds their sport they're passionate about, if they specialize, how do parents help them do it in a safe way? And we've had other guests who've been on and talked about, taking time off and so on and so forth. From a science standpoint, what's your recommendation to parents about how they help make sure a kid doesn't overdo it?
Yeah, it's the biggest challenge out there. And I've done this in a sport of tennis, which is one of the most specialized sports historically. It started the whole youth training academy model. Nick Bollettieri Tennis Academy was in the early 80s started, and that was the first time kids as young as 10, 11, 12 went away from home to live and train.
Probably
for
the
sport.
highest burnout rate of any sport,
Yeah,
too, I would imagine.
exactly. It's really, really challenging. And again, it comes back to, does the kid want it or does the parent want it? That's the first big discussion, which is really hard to make. A parent can't easily evaluate themselves. It's not an easy thing to do. So that's the first question. The second is, up until 12 years old, there's no value at all in early specialization for most sports. You know, gymnastics is a unique outlier in a little ways, but there's majority of sports we typically talk about. You actually get much more benefit out of playing multiple sports at the young age. You get better skills developed. Then there's a time period where competition does become challenging. If you're really good at what you do, your local area may be limited. In certain sports, that's not really the case, but in some individual sports, that potentially you may need to go regionally or nationally to just compete against people similar levels. So then there's travel that kicks in. 12 and under travel, I have trouble with. I don't really understand the need for it, but it's a big industry. So it's more about, you can usually find people in your area to compete against to get your skill sets up. It's once you get older and then you do start needing that competition. And then in tennis, for example, international competition becomes important because there is only a handful of people in the world that you need to beat up on, and they live on the other side of the world. So that's a very unique skill set. For most people we're talking about, you know, the specialization isn't even full specialization. It's just a commitment to one sport. You still may play two sports all the way through high school. For most sports, you can easily do that, but you may be committing a bit more to one. There's one that you think you're more skilled at, but playing that other sport can be really valuable, and it can be a forced rest of certain mechanics. Let's say if it's baseball and football, they have very different skill sets in a lot of ways. There's some similarities, but a lot of the skill sets are different. So you're not overloading one skill set for 11 months of the year just by playing one sport. You're getting 6 and 6 or 7 and 5, whatever it is. So you're developing these other skill sets. And, you know, the old 3-sport idea is still really valuable because you break your year into thirds and you're able to still be active, still be competitive, and still be physically developing, but you're not doing the same thing over and over and over again, which is where a lot of the overuse injuries comes from, and the mental burnout. So we know that. I mean, I think most rational people have seen enough of the data now. There's a lot of information that is consistent in that space. The question you ask, though, is if you have to specialize, and there aren't many people that do. There really isn't. I deal in that world a lot. I have these, like, the best of the best. They're not just number one in the country in their age group. They're number one in their country 2 years older than their age. Like on the women's side in tennis, that's what's kind of the benchmark. You have to be 2 years better than your age to really be in that pathway to be a top pro. So those people are obvious. There's only a handful of them in the country. So that's not a fair discussion for most people. Unfortunately, a lot of people think their kid is that person, and you're like, they're like 4 years behind realistically of where the best are, even though they're good. And not saying they're not good athletes. They're regionally ranked. They're good, doing well in the state, but they're not, on the pro path. And we did a lot of research, and we keep updating it. It's a pathway to the top 100 in tennis in ATP and WTA. So it actually has all this benchmarking. So you can kind of see where people fall. And the hope was that it would put a bit of realism behind some of this. But you also don't want to shatter the dream. There's always a potential for someone to do something that's an anomaly, but you can't make your decisions and rules based on 3 standard deviations. So in science, we look at standard deviations away from the mean. 1 standard deviation from the mean is 68%. 68% of people fall in that block. That's the vast majority. Then 2 standard deviations is 95%. So that's less than 5% fall outside of that. 3 standard deviations is 99%. So less than 1% of people fall outside of 3 standard deviations. Yet most parents are asking about their child who isn't that 3 standard deviation person. yet they think they may be, or they want them to be.
How quickly, because this is such a healthy thing for parents to hear, and tennis was your specialty, obviously, how quickly can you look at an athlete, let's say a 12 and 13-year-old, and really give that parent a realistic view of kind of where their limit is in terms of how far they could go? Not to put, and maybe not to talk to the child, because you don't want to, like you said, you don't want to crush their dreams, but to give that parent more of a realistic view of kind of what that future looks like and what they can do.
Yeah, and it's quite easy because there's a handful of things you're looking at. You're looking at potential physical growth that may happen that hasn't happened. That's one component that could shift the dial a little
going
bit.
through puberty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you can usually see some things though when they're that age. It's parental background. We do some genetic testing on certain things to look at certain gene expressions that are more likely to be fast twitch athletes versus slow. You do all your physical testing, which gives you a sense. But the biggest one is usually the competitiveness, and you put them in stressful environments in their sport and you see how they respond. That's the number one driver with pro success. It's not the physical gifts. There's so many physically gifted athletes in every sport, and very few of them actually make it to the top. Those are the LeBron James of the world that have all the physical gifts, but they also have the ability to read the court. Like LeBron reads the court better than any coach out there, and he can see things 3 or 4 plays ahead, movements ahead. Plus, when he gets injured, he recovers faster than anyone on the planet. And he's, and he trains as hard or harder than everyone. So you need people like that to be the best in the world. So it's hard to say at 12 if they're going to have all the physical gifts yet, but you have a pretty good sense. It's those other factors that are hard to train. They're sort of innate. A lot of those are innate, is that work ethic, that discipline, that day-to-day commitment to doing the right things over and over again. And you sort of see that pretty early on.
It's like the eye test for instincts, too. I coach my team, my daughter's team, and you can tell a couple of the girls that they just get it. And it comes to them quick. They know how to adjust. And like you said, they might not grow. They might not get that next level. But from the other standpoint, they're competitive. They check all the boxes and the other thing.
But I think it's interesting. We've had two athletes pop to my mind right now. One of them's Rowdy Gaines, who fellow Auburn guy. And Rowdy made a statement that was astounding, that there's never been a 12-year-old national champion swimmer who's won an Olympic medal, which is amazing. And the point there was you can't size them up at 12 years old. Rowdy didn't even start swimming until 17.
It may have been more 9 and 10. I don't know if he went to 12. We had to double check on that though. So I'm your fact checker anyway.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But I mean,
We can edit this part.
Yeah, we can edit that. But the point is, but it's a great point though. You made, though.
Yeah, thank you, Brad.
You just may have messed it up, but it's okay.
Yeah, and from the data that we've collected on that transition to the pros, we always said being the best at 9, 10, 11, 12 is not the goal.
Yeah.
It's being in the mix. So your goal is to not be the best, like number one in the country or whatever, number one in the state. It's to make sure you're in the mix if you're trying to play at the highest level. You want to be competitive with those players.
Yeah.
You're not going to necessarily, and because those stats are pretty true, that being number one at that level is not a predictor, but being sort of in the mix, and it's usually in the tennis world, it's 12. 12 is sort of where things start to separate. 14 is a really big predictor.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like you've got to have the skill sets is really what it's saying, is do you have the skill sets in these environments to be competitive, and then a lot of stuff can happen.
Well, it's having the self-awareness, and like you said, tennis is very different, and even golf to a certain extent, but it's always funny to me with football and baseball and basketball, the big three. Huh?
Go ahead. You can see.
Well, I just think you can see, but also I'm saying that you'll hear, like, in Baseball America, this kid's the top 12-year-old in the country. How in the world do you know who the top 12-year-old in the country?
Team sport.
I promise you, there's someone out there that will maul your kid at some point that's the same age. And it's just, that's what, and I think when we talk on this, it's having the realization as a parent, we talk a lot of times, is to be realistic.
Yeah.
Look at I have 4 kids. You can look at my 4 kids and I can go and tell you I'm not going to say it, but you can tell and look and say, this one's got he's got what you said, the competitiveness, the instincts. That's life. It's not, horrible. And this is where we talk those. How do you come alongside these kids as parents to help the kids say, you know what, my kid doesn't have to go play in the big leagues like I did. I want you to be a great high school baseball player. I want you to have fun. I want you to enjoy playing it. And then if you get a chance to go to college, great. If you don't, you know what?
It's okay.
You lived a dream and you go to college and you work. But that's what I think it's the understanding of trying to help these parents walk through this, that your kid's not going to be the next LeBron James.
No, I mean, the kids show themselves. It's like in all sports, the athletes know who the pecking order is in every team.
Yep.
They'll tell you better than the coaches will who's the best, who's the
the
second.
alpha. Yeah.
And the kids show themselves. You've just got to give them the space and the environment to show themselves and give them the ability to let their skill sets develop within that space. And I think that's the biggest value is, there's some kids out there that just don't have the parental influence, the resources to even get exposed. And that's the sad part. You hope that there's the exposure is the goal, and then the kids will develop. I mean, if they're competitive enough, they're going to look at the guy next to them and see they're getting better than I am. What do I need to do differently? And they're going to ask the right questions and try to do that. So it's a tough world though. There's not an easy pathway. I mean, I think that's why everything you all are doing is so important, because you're trying to put good information out there from people that have gone through it, that have lived it, that have seen the positives and the challenges that come up in the space.
So, Mark, you are the director of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So I think you're going to know a lot about what I'm about to ask. And this whole world of
Do you drink Gatorade or Powerade?
or body armor or whatever. But hydration, seriously. Again, I know I'm talking about my personal journey a bit, but my boys struggled like crazy with cramping, and a bunch of other kids that we knew did as well. And that cuts across every sport. In fact, I brought my boys to see you, and you did testing and so on and so forth. Can you just talk about, we got so frustrated with, there's some kids who, barely drank sips of water over 2.5-hour tennis matches in July, and they had no issue. And then there are other kids who have huge issues. But can you just talk about hydration? And we got tired of people telling us eat a banana. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's one of the most debilitating types of injuries. It's a short-term injury typically, but it's a form of injury in athletes. And in the early days, it was a lot about you got to drink more fluid and take more salt. That was kind of the recommendations.
Yeah. Salt tablet.
Yeah. Now there's about 8 to 10 things that we know contribute to cramping. So one is genetics. Is a big part of it. Is there's actually genetic expressions that make, and everyone knows it, that person always cramps. This person never cramps. They do the exact same workout. Why does that person cramp and that person doesn't? There's obviously something genetically predisposed.
Just what it is.
Yeah, so there's that piece of it. But that doesn't mean there aren't things you can do to help with that. So obviously the fluid levels is a huge one. Most people don't realize about 70% of athletes in team sports go into practice dehydrated. And this study's been done pretty much every year for the last 2 decades, and they show the same thing. And it keeps showing that pretty much people walk onto the practice field or the match field dehydrated a little bit to start with. So that's an easy one to get off the table. Make sure they're well hydrated. Most people don't realize that your gut can only consume about 1.5 liters to 1.8 liters of fluid per hour. Yet many males sweat upwards of 2.5 to 3.5 liters. So nearly double of what you can actually comfortably consume. So that's where the disconnect happens.
Yeah.
We can't drink enough during competition to replace what we lose in sweat. It's physically not easy to do because of the gut and the ability to consume and utilize.
Yeah.
So that's where the challenge is. You can't just drink and say drink is the solution. Sodium's so important, which it is, and most people don't realize that you have salty sweaters and you have non-salty sweaters. That's again genetic. So you have people that, if they wear black hats or black t-shirts, cotton kind of black t-shirts, and you sweat for an hour, there's white stains all over it. And then you have other people that don't sweat out a lot of sodium, so they don't need the same level of sodium.
Yeah.
most people don't realize most commercial sports drinks are considered a low sodium food. For Gatorade, for example, is technically a low sodium product. There's 3 times as much salt in a can of soup than there is in a bottle of Gatorade. So just drinking an off-the-shelf sports drink typically doesn't provide much sodium. So you need extra
Have a bowl
sodium.
of soup before the game.
Pretty much. I mean, you know, and in the South, historically, people have salted their foods excessively because of that. It was a natural response to the heat and the humidity. It wasn't to make the food taste better. It was because your taste buds were craving sodium to handle that. So it was a adaptation to the environment. So that was one of the big reasons why. So, you know, and sodium now, we get pretty precise into it. So we'll have specific drinks for athletes based on temperature that they're going to compete in. When I was at Gatorade, we actually did the Brazil national team for soccer when it was in Brazil. And we had to actually create different drink profiles for their athletes based on when they were playing in the Amazon. One of the stadiums was basically in the jungle. One was at altitude. One was on the ocean. So you actually had different compositions based on the environment. So that's the sodium piece. Then you have a nervous system response, which is probably arguably the largest. People typically cramp in competition. They don't cramp in practice. Yeah, 80+% of all cramping occurrences happen when there's a competitive stress environment, not when they're doing a training session. So that has a lot more to do with nervous system response and the inability of the nervous system to handle the stresses. So there are things we do there that actually you take spicy products, so capsaicin, Tabasco sauce, stuff like that. You take a couple drops under your tongue, and it'll actually, in a form, shock the nervous system to reset a little bit when you are getting those first twinges. So there's a strategy there that we can utilize to delay the onset of a cramp. So that can help if you get those first twinges, like a hand twinge or a calf twinge. That can help delay it by a good 20 to 30 minutes.
And there are products out there for that.
Yeah. There's commercial products, and then there's just capsaicin, Tabasco, stuff like that. That is really cheap. And then at the last thing, if you can't do all those, then mild muscle relaxants can help. So if you've got people that are emotionally can't control themselves, they're so emotionally wound up, there's things that can be done. So you try to do everything before you get to that point. Do a lot of visualization, breathing drills, all that. But a lot of this is competitive stress driven. And you have to reduce the anxiety somehow.
So following up on the nutrition theme, this will oversimplify it like I always do, but for parents out there, what if you could recommend 2 things that you would really encourage parents to encourage their children to eat that are really athletes that are serious, and then also 2 things maybe that they shouldn't be eating that would have the biggest impact or biggest negative effect on them?
Yeah, so probably the biggest thing that every athlete should have is some form of, say, protein shake after they work out. It's easy, it's simple, it's relatively low cost, and it just ensures that they get a little more protein throughout the day. Most kids actually don't eat enough protein. Most of the time, unless they're committed to, say, a weight training program and they've been told drink protein. But the younger kids, 12s, 14s, most of them, their diets are pretty bad. I mean, most of the time, they're eating 2 or 3 of the same thing over and over again. It's usually pretty carb heavy, which is not a bad thing. They need the carbs at that age, but they're usually not getting enough protein. So like a chocolate milk is a starting point, but there's better sources out there than chocolate milk. So that would be one.
More for recovery, though,
exactly.
Right?
And it helps a bit with recovery, but it also just improves their macronutrient profile for the day. It's just a 20 to 30 gram extra amount of protein that they may not get from fish or chicken or steak or wherever else they're getting their proteins. Because a lot of kids don't eat a lot of that stuff. Some do, but a lot don't. So that's one simple one. The other one is, really trying to make sure that they get, and it's hard, as much, vegetables and fruit, because typically they don't get enough nutrients from those type of sources. And so that's why a lot of them may need a multivitamin just to cover the bases, because if they're not eating well. So those would be the 2 sort of go-tos. from that standpoint. And then to avoid at the young ages, it's hard because you want them to eat a lot of calories most of the time. Most of the time, they can get away with ice cream. They can get away with the pizza every now and then. They can get away with a lot of the stuff that as they get to late high school and into college, you may need to start really adjusting that nutrition plan. But at the younger ages, it's more about moderation in those things and making sure that they don't overeat on one type of food. If they're a pizza person, they shouldn't have pizza 5 days a week. That type of thing. It's like once a week, twice a week. And if you rotate around enough foods, you hopefully cover all the bases of the nutrition side. The hardest part is don't eat a lot of high-fat foods before training. That usually has a hard time in digestion, and you really run into some problems. The one thing, though, I do see in the youth sports space that parents mess up unintentionally is if you've got multiple games in a day, it's that hours between what do you eat. And there's a concept known as transient hypoglycemia, which basically means if you eat within about 45 minutes of your next physical activity, your next game, you'll walk onto the field or the pitch or wherever you're going, and you'll actually feel a little lightheaded. You'll feel lethargic, low energy, even though you've eaten. And it takes a good 30 minutes for that to subside. So normally, if you've got a really narrow window between games, the recommendation is, have something the moment that previous game finishes, if it's more than an hour. And then if you don't have more than, say, 45 minutes to eat, don't eat during that period. Actually start eating when you start exercising again. Because when you start exercising, it uses what's available immediately. And that's a strategy. Yeah, so you're
So you could have like a bar while you're playing.
Exactly.
So the mom that gives the team,
Juice.
well, no, I was going to say like the sub sandwiches and all that stuff in between double headers is really not doing a favor for that team.
Correct. It's not intentional. They're well-meaning. It's not saying that they're trying to make the wrong decision there. It's just for most athletes, if they notice that their kid is kind of low energy that first 20 minutes of the next game, that's usually why.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's something that we dealt with a lot in the tennis world early on because you would have 1 hour breaks between matches, and that's not enough time to go anywhere, let alone go get something, pick it up, bring it back.
And then play.
Play, yeah.
Wow. So Chick-fil-A 5 days a week is...
For you or for the kids?
Well,
Well, for me, yeah.
There's one of our hosts that's almost 60 or past 60, and you wouldn't recommend him having pizza every day.
60.
Yeah, I'm not going to mention any names, but there is one of us that eats a lot of pizza. So once you get past that,
hey, as I always say, the athlete diet and the non-athlete diet is about as polar opposite as we can get.
The good news is he's not an athlete anymore.
But I'll do a commercial here for Mellow Mushroom Pizza, which is a healthy crust pizza.
Yeah.
A nutritionist told my boys that.
Yep.
So a sports nutritionist.
Okay, there you go.
Spending a few more minutes with you, take us behind the scenes for what a day looks like. Like if you meet with an athlete, what am I walking into?
Yeah, it varies a lot. I have about 8 to 10 professional athletes I work with year round. So we cover everything from the medical side to their day-to-day strength and conditioning program to their routines they do, and then everything that comes in between, the nutrition. Some of them have chefs, so you work with their chefs on their diet plan to fit within their weekly schedule, game schedule, training schedule. Some of them fly all over the world, so you've got a lot of travel science that we have to do. So what do they eat before the flight, during the flight? What technologies do we use to help them not stiffen up, especially long international flights? We deal a lot with that. So we've got technology that we use to help with that. So it varies based on the athlete. So that area is very personalized. You basically go through an analysis of what you currently do, what you like, what you don't like, what you're missing. So a lot of it is kind of filling in the gaps. And many of them work with teams. So they have their trainer on the team. They have their strength coach. They have their nutritionist. So you coordinate with them as well, because I worked in the NBA for a couple of years full-time with a team, so I understand the challenges that the team staff have, because all these pro athletes have their own people back home in the off season, and then some integrate really well and some don't communicate much at all. So I always try to make sure that we have an open line of communication, help where we can, because the goal is to give the athlete the best chance of succeeding. And so that's the pro athlete world, which is pretty unique because of it's very personalized, and it's, you know, I have 3 golfers, I have a couple soccer girls, I have a couple baseball players, a few tennis players, so they've got very different needs. So that world's a bit different. You know, we do every now and then some youth assessments through coaches. It's all word of mouth, and it's through coaches I know, and federations will send people, and they want a second set of eyes. It's like a second opinion kind of concept. What are we doing well? What maybe are we missing? And where can we fill in the gaps? So that's sort of the day-to-day on the athlete side. Then we've got a consulting firm that does a lot of stuff with sport technology, like wearables, all the different recovery devices that are out there, new technology that's coming out with how to monitor athletes better ways. So we do quite a bit of testing in that environment, which is great because it intersects all the other things I do. So you're always up on the latest information, and also the crap that's out there as well. You get sent a lot of stuff that doesn't work, and it's just, you know, people have put a ton of money into a product, and if they just would have had some advice on day one, said, your concept's great, your technology sucks, it's not going to work, it's not valid, it's not reliable, you've wasted $5 million in this without getting some advice on the front end. And there's stuff like that happens quite a bit.
Wow.
Yeah. So the parents have a challenge because they're being marketed with so many products now. Help your kid recover better, help them sleep better, help them eat better, help them throw faster, you know, all the different things that are out there.
And in youth sports, because you mentioned youth sports, what would be the number one deficiency you see in a youth athlete?
Most of the time is their ability to stop, to decelerate, both lower body and upper body. So the best athletes stop better than everyone else. It's not how fast they are, it's how well they stop. And that's both throwing, you know, can they decelerate their arm really well? Everyone talks about how fast can you throw. That's the acceleration part. But you only have so many accelerations before your arm falls off. So you need to learn how to stop. And with movement, the best athletes in any sport, movement-wise, are all the best decelerators. So you think of the best running backs, you think of the best basketball players. They all can change direction faster than anyone else. So that's the number one thing you need to work on.
Is that okay? So you can work on that and improve it.
Yeah, there's definitely people that are just naturally better at it than others, but most people don't work much on that. They're working a lot more on, hey, I want to run faster. You know, I want to jump higher. It's not always about how high you jump and how fast you run. It's about, can you do that and then stop and change. Most sports are reactive. Unless you're running track, where it's just one start and one stop, most movement sports are stop, start, start their entire game.
This is we could easily have a part 2, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I've got like 5 more questions, and I know that we probably can't get to them. But I was going to ask you, Mark, when did you discover this passion? Like, at what point? I know you were a tennis player. When did you realize this is what your calling is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I was like a lot of youth athletes were. I was a pretty good tennis player. I was top 3 or 4 in the country in Australia. Played, you know, the US Open Juniors. Played doubles with Andy Roddick. He was my doubles partner. So I was at a pretty high level. You know, was only looking at playing professional tennis. That was the only goal. And then started having some shoulder problems. And, you know, I literally went through about 3 years of being misdiagnosed. It was pretty early days, and, you know, it was just, you know, ice and, you know, figure it out type of thing. Tendonitis, you know, that was
Take a couple
Advil.
Exactly.
Good to go. Yeah, and you did 3 years of not much,
Yeah.
like all the stuff that they gave you back then, and then, you know, I ended up having a pretty bad tear, a nerve split. So I had pretty extensive surgery on it, and that sort of got me into this whole space of how do you learn more about yourself to try to heal yourself, and then you really got excited about trying to help other people figure it out and, you know, work through the body. And yeah, it was one of those things that was never really a path that I went down with any real plan. Even today, the way stuff has happened has been kind of like this. It goes from one thing to another. The biggest thing I know about myself is I've got to be passionate about it and really like it to do it. Otherwise, I don't do a very good job of it. So the stuff I do now is only stuff I really enjoy and I'm passionate about. And I only work with the athletes that I like now. I have the ability to pick and choose a little more. So the athletes I deal with, like, have that sort of same commitment to the stuff that I think is important.
And we didn't mention their names, and we're not going to, but I mean, he works with a lot of well-known athletes
Right.
that everybody would know. You touched on one thing. I know we got to wrap up here, but there's one thing I want to ask you about that I think all parents will appreciate and kids should listen to. You mentioned the word sleep. And parents, whether kids are athletes or not, they fight with their kids about getting enough sleep. How important is sleep to a young athlete's performance?
Yeah, I mean, sleep is that magic elixir that everyone has access to. Not enough people use it well enough, and it's hard. I mean, it's the athletes I deal with struggle with it as well. Partly due to their schedule, they're flying in different hours, and it's just an
Different time
inconsistency.
zones.
Yeah, it's an inconsistency. The NBA is the worst sport. Baseball's bad, but they're in the same city for 3-4 days, and they don't get to bed that late. In the NBA, you're landing at 2-3 in the morning, and one night is 3 in the morning. The next night you don't have a game, so you may go to bed at 11 or 10. It's such an inconsistent schedule, and that's the real challenge. So the pros have it harder than the youth athletes. So, but you've got to maximize your time. And everyone says it, 8 to 10 hours. That's sort of the more the better. Most people don't get enough. What we try to do is try to create a sleep protocol before they go to bed, so we maximize the time they do sleep. Obviously, if you can extend the time, that's better, but maximize the quality of sleep. So recommend using, say, blue blocking glasses about 20 minutes, 30 minutes before they go to bed. Try to have the phone in another room, which is really hard for most people to do. Don't have it on the side table. Have it at least a room away so that the phone, you're not looking at it within 20 minutes of going to bed. There's some really good data showing your sleep quality goes up a lot if you avoid that. If you can't commit to that, at least put it on night, on the night setting, which changes the blue light. So those pretty big. Make sure that you don't eat too much salt within about 4 or 5 hours of going to bed. So try to limit the salt intake on the night before, like the last meal of the day. Try to have more of the sodium if you are going to consume sodium earlier in the day. Red meat's tough at night for a lot of players and a lot of kids, so try to limit the amount. There's a bunch of things we sort of recommend, and it's just trying to optimize the sleep they get, because we know realistically they're probably not getting the right amount of time. They're reduced on the time they should get, but how do we maximize the quality of that time that they have?
So a 32-ounce tomahawk, probably at 9 o'clock, wasn't good for me when I played. Wasn't the smartest decision.
It's one of those.
So I had the meat sweats.
It's one of the, and if you monitor people's sleep, it's amazing when they do a lot of red meat at night. Even though everyone loves it when they're eating it, you see the sleep profiles change quite considerably.
All right,
Well, you're right. There's gold in these hills, and we
love to have
we
you
would
back.
love to have you back at some point.
anytime.
This is
Yeah,
so
well, we
great.
can't thank you enough, and thanks for joining. This has been so insightful, I think, for us three too, but for parents going through it with their kids. Everybody, like you said, everybody wants to be the top athlete and work, but being able to experience different things. So we thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mark.
It was
Great.
fun being here with you all. Thanks for everything you're doing as well. This is a great resource for parents for sure.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks, guys. Hey, guys, Jeff Francoeur here. Thanks for checking out Pure Athlete, and subscribe to our channel on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen to our podcast.